ready? I'm not seeing Elizabeth. There, I see Elizabeth. Okay, good. Are we ready to get started?
Yeah, I just started recording. So.
Okay, very good. So it's good to see everybody again and to be with you. Um, I'm thinking about how many weeks in a row we've done meetings. And I'm thinking to myself, it must be some kind of record, right? Obviously, we're not doing them the way we prefer to do them. We're not doing them in person, but I do think we have not had successive meetings like this for this long in not in the 5 years that I've been there, that's for sure. So I am trying to get my slideshow to you, and I'm not having any luck. Give me one moment. Let me just see if I can figure out what's going on here. Oh, I see what's going on, I think. Oh, there it is. Okay. So my slideshow is here, but it's not showing up for some reason. Okay, so just give me 1 second. I'm going to take you to the New York Times, sorry, and to their, oh, okay. What are you seeing now? You're seeing the front page of the New York Times, some tennis shoe advertisement? Is that right?
No,
so
I see it says a large share of Black Americans lack health.
You're seeing what I want you to see. All right, yay, thank you. Okay, so part of the reason I was thinking about how many lectures we've done together is because I'm about to start a new lecture series with you. And so we did a long lecture series together on rising inequality. This will not be as long a lecture series, but I may go on for a while because, as you'll see today, and I promise as we progress with this, I will interrupt the lecture series on race and justice in America in the 21st century, for which I'm going to give you historical, critical, and ethical perspectives to talk with you about what's happening in the world as well. And obviously we're in the middle of a presidential election, and so that will intrude. I'm not going to talk with you much about that today. I will tell you very briefly that as far as I can tell, Joe Biden's chances of winning this election have actually increased recently. And that's in part to do with what's happening at the state level, that his lead in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan seem to be holding up. His lead in Florida is narrow, but not yet apparently in danger. And he recently pulled into the lead in North Carolina. Now, I'm sorry to go state by state by state like that, but the fact of the matter is, I don't think anybody thinks that Joe Biden is going to lose the popular vote. The question is whether he'll win the Electoral College vote, and the recent news has been quite good for him. The effort by Trump to make this a law and order campaign appears in a sense to be backfiring because more people actually view Biden as better for law and order than Trump, at least for the order part of law and order. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about that today. We'll come back to that in future weeks. Today, I want to, with a heavy heart, talk with you about what you're all too painfully aware of already, which is that the fires in the Western United States are taking a terrible toll. And I will talk about the human dimension of this, but I want to put this in larger perspective in two ways. And the first thing, by the way, just so you're aware, these images are enhanced. Obviously, it's not the case that the entirety of California is consumed in flames, but this is a way of measuring the magnitude of fires. Frankly, it's designed for fires that don't have the magnitude of the fires that we're seeing right now, so-called mega fires that consume 1 million or more acres, make it appear that the entire state is on fire because the radius of the heat and smoke that they generate is so large. But to put this in larger context in two ways. The first is to say that although obviously on the west coast of the United States right now, we're primarily focused on what's happening in that area, this is not an exclusively Californian or American phenomenon. If we look at what's happening in South America, using the same kind of imaging, right? What we're seeing in South America is even more devastating, more in the southeast of South America, where some of the most important rainforests in the world are contained. We're seeing widespread forest fires. It's not getting as much attention, but it is, in a sense, even more devastating, even more threatening than what's happening in the west coast of the United States. Now, like I say, I want to focus a little bit on the human dimension to this, and I'm sorry to assault you with images like this, but I think it's important to confront. This is what climate change means, right? We've got the intersection of several phenomena, a protracted drought, which has rendered areas in Oregon and Washington that almost never have forest fires so dry that they're actually burning. A extreme heat wave, and then really unprecedented weather developments in the form of dry lightning. This is what scientists had warned, climatologists had warned for a long time, would begin to happen with the rate of climate change, the degree of climate change that we have unleashed on the planet. That as opposed to there being one problem at a time, we would get multiple overlapping or intersecting problems. And so this is what it does. This is what it looks like. That's a trailer park in Phoenix, Oregon, nothing left. This is a neighborhood in Medford, Oregon, right? Those are houses in blocks, nothing left but the trees in the center of the block, right? To be honest, I'm not sure I can even fully make sense of this. I believe that's the center of the block. And just so you can see at the more detailed level, this is merciless devastation, right? That used to be a home. All that's left is a barbecue, a washer and dryer, maybe a heating unit, things that are so solid and metal in their construction that they don't fully melt in the blaze and inferno that these fires are generating. This is what it looks like on the ground. And as again, you are all too well aware, these are firestorms, right? These are fires that move at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, that jump long distances, miles, because of the embers that are airborne, that are very difficult to contain and very dangerous, that can come at you from multiple directions at once and overwhelm you if you have only one good way to exit. These are very dangerous events. And as we know, there are dozens dead, and many anticipate that the numbers will go up in Oregon especially. This is what the air looks like. Again, you are all too aware of this. You've seen this out your windows recently. And I just want to point out and to tell you something that I imagine you're already aware of, but reinforce it. Exposing yourself to this kind of air is unhealthy in a number of ways. But one of the things that public health officials report is that in areas that have had these kinds of fires, the incidence of the flu in the following flu season increases fivefold. That's because of the damage that this kind of smoke, these kind of fine particulate matters that can be taken all the way into the lungs, and the toxins that burning houses generate. It damages the tissue of the lung, and it makes you more susceptible to the flu. We don't know. It's a novel virus. We don't know, but there's every reason to believe that exposure to this kind of smoke will also make you more susceptible to the virus. And so that's in part to say, please be careful. That's in part to say, this is one of the things that's going to happen in the aftermath of these fires. It's not just the fires, the devastation, the loss of life, the loss of homes, the loss of millions of acres of forest, right? Approaching 5 million acres. To give you a sense, that's approximately the size of the state of New Jersey that has been consumed by these fires over the last month. And then this is what the forest looks like in the aftermath of these fires. These are ghost forests, right? These are no longer living forests. We can hope that some of these trees will come back, but many of them are probably permanently lost. So this, I assume, is familiar to you. I just wanted to start here today because, in a sense, I feel like we get distracted sometimes. There is a singular looming existential threat to the species and the planet. There is a process that is unfolding slowly, but is increasingly clear in its scope, its magnitude, and in fact accelerating. And that is global climate change, global warming, global heating, and the devastating fires of the Western United States and South America right now are the product of that change that humans have produced. And as I just then want to say a little bit about this, that unfortunately, we should anticipate that these kinds of events will occur with greater and greater frequency. One person who's written a book on this indicates that one way to think about this is wherever you are on the planet, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're moving south in terms of your climate at about the pace that a second hand moves on a watch. So that every year you're moving about 15 miles further south in terms of the climate. So if you're in Northern California, you're moving much closer to Central California in terms of the climate, in terms of the heat, in terms of the weather events you can anticipate. And so this is going to get worse, and it's going to get worse relatively quickly and inevitably. We've unleashed this, and we cannot put it back in the box. And so we are going to see this multiple intersecting climate or weather crises occurring around us at the same time and doing true damage. Now, in addition to that, it's also the case that this is, as with so much in climate change, a matter of self-reinforcing cycles, or sometimes they're called feedback loops, in which climate change causes events that cause more climate change, right? And so, as I've just said, we've lost millions of acres of forest, and in Central America and South America, it's even worse in terms of the loss of forest. As we know, trees are among the most efficient carbon sinks on the planet. They take carbon dioxide out of the air and put it into their wood, their tissue, and into the ground as well. And so on the one hand, when forests are destroyed, the planet loses its capacity to absorb carbon dioxide at the same rate. And on the other hand, when trees are burned, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I've not seen models yet for how much climate change these fires will contribute to, but these fires will contribute in the short term to having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and in the long term to diminishing the planet's capacity to remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so this is just one of many instances where climate change induces events that produce more climate change. Third aspect of this is that we are exceeding the capacity of our government and our civilization to cope with what climate change produces. And to be simple about this, there's no plan for this many fires burning at one time. We do not have the resources. We do not have the manpower to fight them. As you're well aware, fire crews are coming in from Australia and Israel and elsewhere in the world to assist with this because we have overtaxed our capacity. And this is going to happen again and again, right? Which is to say, either we're going to build up a huge disaster response infrastructure, or we're going to be overwhelmed again and again. And at the same time, what we're seeing in Oregon with approximately 1 in 10 persons in the state, either on evacuation orders or on standby evacuation orders, is that there's just not enough places to put them. There's not enough housing, there's not enough hotels, there's not enough shelters, there's not enough tents, right? And of course, this is complicated by the fact that we're in the middle of a coronavirus where we're supposed to be maintaining social distance. But even if we didn't have that constraint, we would still not have the capacity to house 5 to 10% of the state. It could get more. We could have 20% of the state displaced if this fire moves aggressively towards Portland. Let's hope it doesn't. It appears the weather's cooperating right now. But all that to say, again, as a harbinger of things to come, we should anticipate disasters that are going to overwhelm our capacity to manage them. This is what climate change does. So, final couple matters in regards to this. We are becoming increasingly clear about the process that we have unleashed but cannot control, the process of global climate change. When I say we, in the first instance, I'm talking about the avant-garde of human knowledge, climate scientists, ecologists, people who are making a career out of bringing scientific methodology to understanding what climate change does and predicting the course that it's going to take. On the other hand, I think there's an open question, right? And I'm sure you've seen the reports on the fact that there were false rumors circulating that Antifa, the anti-fascist, disorganized, loose coalition of left-wing activists that is particularly active in Oregon, that they set these fires in order to induce people who live in right-leaning communities to abandon, to be able to loot and burn their homes, right? That this is part of the propaganda. This is circulating online. Obviously, not all of us understand what's going on with climate change, but I am cautiously optimistic that the coronavirus pandemic is making clear to us a style of thinking that if we don't use, we are going to find ourselves in ever greater trouble. I would call it, for lack of a better word, systems thinking. That we need to understand that the planet is composed of complex interlocking systems. That one way to think about the overall ecosystem of the planet is as a single system, a Gaia system, and that when we damage one aspect of that system, it may reverberate in difficult to anticipate ways all throughout the planet, and that we need science. We need the best understanding of these processes in order to be able to cope with them. To be a little bit more direct, if you listen to the scientists, you may have a fighting chance to take the steps that will save you from the coronavirus. If you listen to the scientists, you may have a fighting chance to take the steps that will mitigate the consequences of climate change, if not reverse them. And so let's get concrete here for a minute. What do we understand better today? Well, in 2015, just 5 years ago, the countries of the world, almost all of them, I think over 180, got together in Paris and signed the Paris Accords to contain climate change, right? They pledged in the preamble to that accord to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about a little bit less than 3 degrees Fahrenheit. We've now crossed the 1 degree Celsius threshold, right? That's what we're seeing right now is the consequence of 1 degree Celsius temperature increase. We've crossed the 420 parts per million carbon dioxide threshold, a threshold that hasn't been passed in 3 million years on the planet. But when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, the global consortium of scientists who study this under the auspices of the United Nations, looked at what the countries who signed the Paris Accords pledged, they added it all up, right? And then they ran their models to try to figure out if each country actually met its pledge, how much climate change would there be in the 21st century? And their conclusion is that there would be between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius of climate change this century, right, over the next 80 years. That the preamble pledge to 1.5 degree is not met by the actual commitments of countries. And so that the framework that the Paris Accords represents needs to be ratcheted up radically, right? We need global action to actually meet the goals of the Accord that far exceeds the commitments of the Accord. And so when I say we are learning, we're learning in two respects. We're learning that if you're in the Gulf Coast, you're going to be hit by hurricanes and storm surges on a regular basis because of the increased temperature and energy that the ocean contains and that it transmits to atmospheric events. We're learning that if you live in the Western United States, you're going to see fire seasons that start in August and extend through November and that burn unprecedented numbers of acres. We've learned that if you live in the northeastern United States, you're going to be increasingly subject to summer heat waves that endanger life and to forms of mosquito-borne illness that was simply not an issue 10 years ago. Right. And so we're learning about the actual consequences of this for our lives at the same time that we're learning about the nature of the process itself. And my hope is that the coronavirus contributes to this learning about the capacity for us together to quote, flatten the curve, to produce results not only through governmental action, but also through individual action and by demanding governmental action. Because what we need is a radical change in the nature of our civilization. It is going to be costly. It is going to be hard. It is going to be fiercely resisted by industries that stand to profit from the current infrastructure of energy production and energy use. But it certainly is possible now. And I think that's the silver lining in all of this, is that over just the last decade, there have been remarkable advances in clean energy production, in wind, in water, in solar. There have been quite phenomenal developments in energy storage. And that's I think at this point, the bottleneck, but I think we are getting there technologically to be able to produce energy during the day and store it for its use at night, for instance. And so what we need is a society-wide commitment, something akin to the Moonshot or the Manhattan Project to tackle this, but also global leadership. And it demands cooperation from the United States and China and Europe and, alas, Brazil, right? And so where cooperation isn't forthcoming, significant pressure needs to be brought to bear to do something about this. And so that's good news in the midst of what's a lot of bad news. I'm going to stop there just for a moment and invite your questions, your comments, your thoughts. I'm unmuting everyone, so you know that your background noise will be heard. You may have to hit your space bar to unmute yourself as well. Anybody have a comment or a thought about all of this? And I know you are experiencing this directly yourselves. Go ahead, please.
Marion.
Yeah, go ahead, Marion.
I'm puzzled by one thing. It seems to me that with the fires, at least, it's very much due to heat and drought, and there isn't really anything that humans can do about that. So I'm not quite so sure that we're responsible for this particular happening, and I don't know what we can do about it. So that it doesn't seem to me that this is something that the human race has actually done. I think it seems to be something that nature is doing on its own.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and mute so that we don't get a lot of background noise. You can unmute yourself. I'll unmute you in a moment. Marion, I'll say two things. One of them is to point out to you that there's a clear path of human contribution to this. And that's in terms of forest management. And for around 100 years, the U.S. Forest Service has had in place a policy, which was the 10 a.m. policy. When a forest fire starts, you put it out by 10 a.m. the next day, right? And the result is that there's this huge store of fuel in our forests, right? And so part of the reason these fires are burning so fiercely is because we have allowed that kind of accumulation to occur through, as it turns out, in a way that I think everybody now acknowledges was misguided forest management policy. Had a lot to do with profiteering in terms of wanting to be able to get the maximum value out of the forest. It also has to do with the fact that more and more of us live at the so-called interface between nature and human civilization. We've built literally over 1 million houses right into the forests on the west coast of the United States over the last 50 years. So that's one thing to notice, that I think where human causation is unambiguous and clear. But the next thing to notice is that the heat wave that you refer to, the drought that you refer to, these are, it seems, symptomatic of climate change. Now, I have to be careful here. Causation in science is always difficult to establish. Causation in systems as complex as an ecosystem or the climate is very hard to establish. But what we're seeing with planetary increase of temperature by 1 degree. And by the way, let me go back to something here for a moment. I think I've got one more slide I might be able to share with you that might help to illuminate this a little bit. Yes, okay, so these are scenarios for the amount of carbon dioxide emission, right? And what we can see from 1940 to 2000 is that the amount of carbon dioxide has gone up. And what we can see is that if we were to continue on the trajectory that we're on right now, it's going to go up exponentially throughout the remainder of the 21st century. A stabilization level would look something like this and eventually begin to decline over the course of the 21st century as forests and oceans began to absorb some of the carbon dioxide we've emitted, right? Now, we know that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere is higher than it's been for 3 million years. We also know from the archaeological record, from looking deep down into ice cores where we can go back tens of thousands of years and see how hot and cold summers and winters were by seeing how much ice got deposited and how much it melted, or by looking at the rings in ancient forests, that there's a pretty straightforward correlation between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the temperature. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more the temperature goes up. That's exactly what science would predict because carbon dioxide is a heat trapping gas. And so what this scenario shows is if we were to do even better than we hope, how much the temperature would go up. And please note that even in the best scenario, the temperature goes up between 1.5 and 3 degrees. And by the way, the people who study this believe that once you go up 2 degrees Celsius, you're almost bound to go up to 3 degrees Celsius global temperature increase. And the reason is once you go up 2 degrees, the permafrost and much of the polar ice caps collapse. And that by itself then emits a whole bunch of methane, which traps more heat and decreases the reflective potential of the planet, which means more heat stays on the planet. So all that to say, we're quite likely, if we do very well, to be in scenario 2 or 3, which is global temperature increases between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius. And frankly, anything above 3 makes a significant portion of the planet uninhabitable. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you now, Marion, is because one of the things we're coming to appreciate is that heat waves and droughts are in fact increasingly produced by increases in global temperature, and that the increase in the global temperature is produced by the carbon dioxide that we're emitting into the atmosphere. So in a sense, we are causing the natural phenomena that are causing the fires, I think is the short, compressed way to put this. It's complicated. We may not be able to say exactly that global climate change produced the dry lightning storms that triggered so many of the fires in Northern California. But we can say that global climate change contributed to the drought and the heat wave that made it such that when that lightning struck, it was very likely that there were going to be fires and they were going to be very hard to contain. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, it's sad, but it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not happy news. I know.
David?
Anybody else? Let me unmute everyone again, and we'll probably get an echo chamber for a moment, but I want everybody to have.
John Campbell has had his hand up to speak.
Oh, go ahead. It's funny. He's not on my screen. Usually he's on my screen. John, please.
Thank you. You say that you're optimistic, and I do have no idea why. I am, seriously, I'm very close to hopeless about all this. I'm a little worried that atomic weapon, some nuclear war is going to wipe us out first. But honestly, the point that you're not mentioning here so much is political capacity. We may have the scientific capacity, but politically, globally, the collective action problem of who's going to, Japan is still financing coal mines. The countries of actually doing anything, it's been proven they talk, but they won't do anything. But domestically, last week, Bonnie Hughes asked, how come climate change isn't an item on the campaign? I don't remember what you answered, but the answer is clear why it isn't. If people thought that voters would respond to it, they would speak up about climate change. Trump speaks up about climate change every day because it's ridiculous. But in general, the Democrats, I think it was mentioned maybe twice during the convention. I'm not sure, just in passing. But there seems to be, I mean, if this is true in the election, what sort of mandate comes out of the election for somebody to do something as difficult and as opposed by so many people as any real action about climate change? So I don't see any room for optimism whatsoever.
Thanks as always for your hopeful comments, John. Let me talk about the details of what you said for just a second. At the very beginning of Joe Biden's acceptance speech, he said we are facing a fourfold crisis in the United States in 2020. I firmly expected him to say we were facing a threefold crisis. The first crisis, of course, is the virus. The second crisis is the economic depression or recession the virus is causing. The third crisis is the crisis of racial reckoning, catalyzed by the video of George Floyd. The fourth crisis that he mentioned was the climate change crisis. And so he led his speech with that, right? His platform endorses a Green New Deal program. And there were several segments in the Democratic nominating convention in which there was an actual 5-10 minute focus on climate change. By the way, there was absolutely no focus on climate change in 2016. No mention of climate change by a single Democratic candidate in the primary debates of 2016. This is not moving as fast as it should, but there is some movement. Now, here are my grounds for optimism. On the one hand, what the coronavirus is teaching us is about the need for systems thinking, for concerted collective action that isn't only funneled through the government. I absolutely agree that our government is captured in ways that makes it completely incapacitated to deal with this. If there's going to be successful action, it's going to have to be at the state, local, and individual level. But so maybe, right, seeing that New York has been more effective at managing the coronavirus. The states that took it seriously early do better, in part because their citizens actually complied with common sense scientific and medical norms, and that we could do the same thing with climate change. Now, were that it were as interesting, as easy as wearing a mask and social distancing, right? A lot more is going to have to change about our civilization. We have to stop using cars. We have to stop using as much electricity as we use right now. When I say using cars, using internal combustion motors, right? We probably have to eat a lot less meat than we eat right now. There are things we can do as individuals. There are things we absolutely need our government to do. Here's the other ground for cautious optimism, and that is that I think people are starting to get it, right? And please note that the fires are not just west of the Cascades, they're east of the Cascades. And so really conservative areas are being hit by this. Please note that the Gulf Coast includes Texas and Louisiana, very conservative states that are being impacted by this, that the storm surges are hitting in very conservative areas in southern Florida, right? And so this is learning the hard way. It's not learning fast enough. It's not learning with science. It's learning when it hits you in the face, right? We're being clobbered by climate change, and maybe it begins to sink in at a practical level. Having said all of that, we are fast on our way to a 2 degrees Celsius plateau. And as I've said, the science predicts when we hit 2 degrees, we unleash processes that will get us to 3 degrees very quickly. The science also predicts when we get to 3 degrees, billions of people's homes will be rendered uninhabitable by the change, desertification, right? Billions of people who live in Asia and the Middle East will find where they live to be no longer supportive of human life. It will be like trying to live in the Sahara Desert, right? And so this is not good by any stretch. What I'm trying to do is say it's not doomsday. That there is some grounds for thinking we might be able to do something about this in time to mitigate it, not in time to prevent it, not in time to contain it. But at the same time, the other thing we have to do is obviously to start building up the capacity to cope with it. And that's going to be really hard. Matt, go ahead. Matt, I've tried to unmute you. Let me try one more time.
Yeah, okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Have you given any thought to the geoengineering ideas, which are to put a sunshade over the earth in some way so as to, temporarily mitigate the global warming problem?
Yes, so I have, and look, anything that works would be great. And on the other hand, let me just quote you for a minute from Mark Lynas, L-Y-N-A-S, his book, Our Final Warning, 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency. And he says in the book that geoengineering solutions are, quote, a Faustian bargain. He says, quote, the planet we would bring into being would not be the earth I love and want to protect. And so, for instance, spraying sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere is one of his example, might cause tremendous acidification of the oceans, right? And all that to say, if the Earth is a Gaia system, if it is a large interconnected system, an ecosystem, and you fundamentally alter one aspect of that ecosystem, can you anticipate where else in the ecosystem those dominoes are going to fall, what the consequences are going to be? So it seems to me that if we could come up with, people talk about putting huge satellites surrounding the Earth with mirrors in them to deflect some of the sun before it gets to the Earth's surface. That might be a geoengineering solution that doesn't have effects on the Earth's ecosystem other than cooling it down a little because it actually is outside of the Earth's atmosphere. But if you're doing anything on a planetary scale in the Earth's ecosystems, then I think you have to be really worried about unintended consequences. There's another concept here, and I don't want to talk about this forever, but there's so much to talk about, which is solution bias, right? And this is a common problem in engineering and science. If there's a problem, there must be a solution, right? I worry that when we start looking into geoengineering, we're maybe kidding ourselves a little bit about an easy way out as opposed to the hard way, which is to really change the infrastructure of consumption, the way in which we live. Anyone else? Oh, Matt, you want to follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. John Campbell is worried about the problem of getting everybody in the boat, getting cooperation internationally to do something about this. The interesting thing about the geoengineering is that any nation could do it for the whole world. They don't have to ask anybody, they just do it. And I think that there are some nations that may not be as seriously concerned, or at least may just have a cost-benefit analysis that accepts the problems you've mentioned and figures they're not as bad as the problems of global warming.
Yeah, and Matt, I happen to know that you started your life as a lawyer and you evolved into being a scientist, engineer, and inventor, and I think I'm hearing why, right? Bypass the messiness of the need for cooperation in politics, solve it through science and engineering. There's something to be said for that, and clearly our situation is growing increasingly desperate. But having said that, it's also the case that I guess I need to see more about what the geoengineering looks like before I'm convinced that it's safe or appropriate. All right, so if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to move into the topic that I announced I would be lecturing on today, and that is, of course, race and justice in the 21st century. And so this is a lecture series. I want to give you a brief overview of the topics I'm going to be covering. And already I can tell I'm probably not going to move at this pace, given that we just spent 3/4 of the first week talking about climate change. But I want to give you a historical overview of race and racism in America but not exclusively the 21st century. I then want to talk about the law and freedom struggles and the way in which, on the one hand, we've had important, inspiring, transformative civil rights struggles in this country on several occasions, right? In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, in the Civil War and its aftermath, and obviously in the 1950s and 1960s, and perhaps we are beginning such a process today. That's part of the impetus for doing this lecture series. But I also want to talk about the limited success of these movements, and in particular, the limited success of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and how, in a sense, it's overwhelmed by the way in which the law of the 20th century, the New Deal in particular, federal efforts to increase middle-class home ownership, to make education more widely acceptable, how good liberal political policy generated, amplified, accelerated racial inequality in the middle of the 20th century. And so that's a second big topic. A third big topic is understanding race beyond politics in the state, understanding it as a social phenomenon, looking at, for instance, psychology and sociology. And so assuming that not every police officer who ends up using excessive or lethal force against an African American is actually a racist, that some of them are actually African American, that some of them are in fact very much committed to not perpetrating racial injustice, and nevertheless, they react in ways that even they regret after the fact because of the way in which race taints their perception of the situation. So how does race get inside our heads? How does race order our interactions with other people, order the geography of our society and looking at some very interesting and important contemporary social science. I think there have been real advances in understanding how race operates as a social construct over the last 20, 30 years. One other perspective I want to open up is a more multiracial, complex, so-called intersectional perspective on race. So moving away from black and white, which will be the organizing binary of the first 3 weeks, and into the idea that in fact America has a racial pentagon at least, right? That we have white and black and Asian and Latino or Latinx and Native American, and increasingly we have people who resist being categorized in any one of those categories, at least exclusively. They say, I am several of those things at once, and by the way, my gender, my sexuality, my class matters as well. So looking at race and identity in a more complex perspective will be the fourth main topic. And then the fifth and final topic will concentrate on justice and ethics and democracy, what we can do about racial inequality in the 21st century if we want to make a successful transition into being a multiracial democracy that is fair and just and inclusive for all its members. And so having built the foundations in the first 4 weeks, the final topic is, what should we do about this? So that's the background, the overview. Today, I want to talk with you about the history of race in America. I'll be very brief here. There's so many wonderful works on this, right? That it's really hard to select just a few, but I have. George Frederickson, the Stanford historian, one of the most important historians of race and racism, has a wonderfully accessible book, Racism: A Short History. Howard Wynett, a sociologist at UC San Diego, has a, I think, very comprehensive sociological introduction to race called The World as a Ghetto, Race and Democracy Since World War II. Many of you probably saw the New York Times 1619 project. It came out a little bit more than a year ago to mark the 400th anniversary of the first involuntary importation of Africans for their labor to North America. This is in other words, the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the slave trade, and really trying to make that entire process, the process of importing and enslaving African Americans and their ongoing exploitation, central to the story of American history as opposed to peripheral. And then finally, an author who gets a lot of attention these days, Ibram Kendi, his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is one of the new reading list of anti-racial studies. His earlier book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, I think is a very useful guide to American history from the perspective of race. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with a qualification. And I'll say this only once, but I hope you'll bear it in mind. I am obviously not an African American. I'm categorized as white, as European, and I've studied this. I've spent some years thinking about this. It's important to me to understand it in its complexity and its awfulness, the history of race and racism, slavery, segregation, exploitation, subordination in our history. But at another level, I am, because of my race, deprived of certain kinds of experiences that would allow me to perhaps have a fuller understanding. I do not walk into a store and get racially profiled. When I get pulled over by the police, my heart rate and anxiety level don't go through the roof because I'm worried that I'm going to be shot. I don't have to worry when I stand in front of a classroom that I'm being judged primarily on the basis of my skin color, or if I think about that, it's not a handicap that needs to be overcome. right? And so at an experiential level, at an affective or emotional level, there are aspects of the way in which race operates in our society that I clearly understand, if at all, only intellectually and not at the deep lived level. And so I will do some work in these lectures to try to introduce you to some people who do present that experience in ways that I hope will make it both intelligible and immediate, right? That some of the depth of the way in which race gets under your skin and into your psyche will be illuminated by talking about authors who've studied it a lot or written about it from a first-person perspective in a memoir or a narrative. So that's my qualification. I will have to rely on others for that aspect of this course. I will then give you a brief overview of racial inequality, a little bit of definitional work. I'm smiling because I'm down to 3 minutes. I'm not possibly going to do all of this today. Let me jump in, stop overviewing, and just give you a little bit of a sense of why we're having this conversation now. And this is a map from August of and early August, I believe, the places in the United States that had protests against racial injustice, against police violence since the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police in late May. And please note the size of the dots, right? Those are 500,000 or more people in a protest. And please note that that didn't just happen on the coast, right? That happened in the center of the country. That happened in Colorado and New Mexico and Las Vegas, right? Places you wouldn't think that would have protests of that size have had massive protests against racial injustice, many more in the 100,000 to 500,000. You know, I'm sorry, and I am misreading this diagram. Let me correct myself. This is the population of the city, not the number of people who attended the protests. My apologies for that confusion. And so there have been protests in cities large and small. I started looking at this and thinking to myself, could you really get 500,000 people in the streets in some of these cities? Are they even big enough? And obviously that's the population of the city as the whole, not the number of people attending the protests. But all of this to say, there have been literally thousands of protests. And by the way, this diagram doesn't note when the same city has had protests on multiple times. So we know that Portland has essentially had a protest every night for over 100 days, right? And so we are, in the phrase that's bandied about at the moment a lot, in a moment of historical reckoning, in a moment of heightened attention. It's being reflected in the fact that politics is taken to the streets. It's out of doors. It's not just in the corridors of power, in the institutions where policy is made. There's a sense that those institutions have failed us so badly that we have to go out into the streets. And of course, and I'm sorry for sharing this awful image with you again, this is what prompted it all, right? This is George Floyd. This is an image of a man being murdered, right? And being murdered by the police after he's been handcuffed, after he's been subdued, when he clearly poses no threat to them, when he's saying again and again, I can't breathe, right? And of course, the police officer who ultimately is now going to be on trial for the murder of George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, does this with kind of clinical detachment, right? Looking right into the camera with seemingly no concern for the man who he's assaulting or the fact that he's being filmed while he's doing it. And so I think I've said this to you before, but it seems to me part of the reason that we are in protests right now is because of the sheer visceral impact of this image. And frankly, if you've got the stomach for it, the video, the 8-minute long video of George Floyd's life being choked out from him. It's hard to watch and not be overwhelmed with grief, but also with anger and indignation at the unnecessary, unjust racial violence occurring here. It's not only that, however. I think that, as I've said to you before, this image presents a map of racial subordination in America. One easy way to understand that would be to reverse the racial roles. If this police officer were Black, if this man were white, would this be occurring? Would his peers be standing around and watching nonchalantly, right? And I think the simple answer to that is obviously that this reflects a map of racial power and subordination. And that in a sense, what's on display here is not only police violence, but the social racial order of the United States. And that what all of these protests reflect is a concerted collective effort to say it's time for this to change. All right, I will stop there. I will again spend a few minutes with you on questions, comments, but I will just note that I barely scratched the surface. There's a lot more that I want to talk about, and we'll start talking with you about in the coming week. All right, I'm going to unmute everyone again. And whoever has a question, please go ahead. Yeah, who is that?
Oh, unmute. We can't hear you.
Who's trying to talk?
Flossie is trying to talk and she's muted.
Oh, Flossie, okay. Flossie, I think you have to hold your space bar down.
Okay.
There we go.
Now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now?
Yes, yes, go Flossie.
David,
Yes.
better get the hell out of here because we're going to shoot the messenger. It's been so painful to hear you. So painful that I would rather die than spend another minute listening to this. And it's all too true. And I can understand now why people shoot the messenger. They don't want to hear it. Well, you made us hear it and see it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Flossie, you're making me rethink what I'm doing, and I try to be direct and honest with you. It seems to me you've earned it, and when things look bleak, I tell you they look bleak. Let me be clear. Climate change is irreversible at this moment, as far as we can tell. That doesn't mean that the planet has to become uninhabitable. By the way, you know, if you look back at the history of, say, economics, so you look at somebody like Reverend Malthus, who worried, right, 300 odd years ago, that we were very quickly exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet and that there would have to be mass starvation given population growth. We quickly actually innovated the technology to be able to feed now 7 billion people, right? And that, of course, is part of the problem with climate change is when, you know, a significant portion of that population starts to want beef. When we use industrial agriculture to feed them, that breaks the carbon cycle of traditional agriculture. When they start to drive cars, things get bad. But having said that, remember that technological breakthrough that made that level of population possible. Maybe Matt is right. Maybe there is a technological engineering solution to this. I'm not sure if it's a geoengineering solution. Maybe it's a different kind of solution, but maybe we will be able to cope with this. As Faulkner said, not only persevere, but prevail. Having said that, I want also to be clear. I'll start out with what's awful about racial history, because I need to make the case that we have a collective obligation to reparations for African Americans. I want to be clear. That's where I'm going at the outset. And I think the evidence is convincing. I think if we were to do it, you know, and I can already hear John Campbell saying, you know, how realistic is that? Which, you know, which planet do you live on? But I'm not as convinced that it's impossible. And if we were to do it, if we were to do it, we would actually lay the preconditions for being the first successful multiracial democracy in the world. And so, yes, things are difficult, things are bleak, but I don't think they are insurmountable yet. And so I want to be clear about that. If I really were of the opinion that what I'm telling you about is uniformly awful, I'm not sure I could do it. Thank you for the comment, Flossie. I'm going to unmute everyone again because we had a little background noise. And anybody else with a question or a comment at this point? All right, everybody. So do take care. Do be well. Try to avoid that awful air if it's still around. And next week, I will try to get us much further into these lectures on racial justice. Have good weeks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David.